Testing. Is this thing on? Hopefully the students of IBI have successfully accessed this video. This is a test for me, and I think it's probably a first for you guys. This is what's called a flipped classroom, where I prepare this lecture here in my office in Gardner Street, and then you watch it in the comfort of your own home or on a bus or wherever it is you do your homework, and you come to class hopefully that bit more equipped so that we can have an informed and vibrant conversation. At least that's the theory. This is an experiment. We're going to give it the best shot we can and let's see how it works. What I want to talk about today is two things. First of all, the theme of home and finding home in the scriptures, and then at the same time I want to talk about the problems with home, housing and homelessness in Irish society. So we've got the biblical material here on one hand, and then we've got the policy problem on the other one. The real critical human tragedy and suffering that comes with the fact that in Ireland today we are not able to guarantee a home to every single person. So I want to get you thinking about the scriptures, and then I want to get you thinking about the world in which you live. And those two things, hopefully you'll see how they come together in the course of this video, and we'll be able to flesh that out then in class. And this is again an example of what it means to do ethics. Descriptions are prior to decisions, and they're more important than decisions. So to describe the question of homelessness in terms of the scriptures is the fundamental evangelical Christian move, and then to turn from the scriptures to the world is what it means to be involved in mission. And hopefully at the end of this session you'll be able to understand, to some degree anyway, why superficially boring bureaucratic reports about house building and zonal planning from local authorities and technical engineering problems about how do you build large numbers of houses in a short period of time, that how all of those things can be properly construed as theological, and it's not stuff that's alien or at a remove from Christian life. And if it's where you're working, if it's where people in your church are working, it's no less potentially of significance to the kingdom of God than more traditional ministry. So there's the whole thing here. There's hopefully scriptural engagement, there's ethical engagement, and there's this larger picture of how it applies in terms of how we understand work and how we understand the ministry of those who are in our church. So I'm going to press pause here, we're going to get things set up, and then we will begin by tracing the line of home and the search for home through the biblical narratives. The most loved cultural stories that we have are stories that rotate around the idea of finding home. So in the classical world we can think about the Odyssey and the Aeneid, or perhaps more relevantly for you guys today, we can think about the Lord of the Rings. What's motivating Frodo throughout his long journey to Mordor is the desire to get back again to the Shire. These are stories that captivate us and that grab our imaginations because we're able to empathize with the character in their longing for home. They may have wanderlust that takes them away from home, but then they have a homesickness that brings them back. And what Frodo finds when he returns finally at the end of the Lord of the Rings to the Shire, what he finds there is what characterizes the Lord of the Rings technically in terms of literary genre as a tragedy. The world that he goes back to, the home to which he returns, is not the same one from which he left, which is one of the profound and recurring themes that we find in these stories. The stories that aren't about finding home tend to be about missing home. So G.K. Chesterton can talk about the restlessness within us that leaves us feeling homesick while at home. Thus, stories of exploration are usually, in their wanderlust, also about trying to find a home. This comes as no surprise to biblical scholars because the long story of the Bible can be understood as a story about finding a way home. Specifically, it's the story of finding a way home between two trees. It starts with a home. The Bible begins with home. The creation stories of Genesis are, speaking in terms of literary genre, leaving aside all the controversial questions about evolution and science, all that stuff that you don't find in the text, we leave that aside. In literary genre, this is a story about God planning a sort of royal garden for himself, and at the center of that garden is a tree. Adam and Eve are placed in it, and there they are at home. God says it's all good. Adam and Eve are happy, they're enjoying each other, they're tending the animals, they're cultivating the crops. They're at home. The story of how we lost home is what we call, in theological terms, the fall. Theologically speaking, what the story of that tree and what the serpent says is that Adam and Eve turned domesticity into tyranny. By refusing relationship with God and harmony with creation, they instead opted to make themselves pseudo-lords, pretend lords, rebel lords. Home, biblically speaking then, is more than a house. The loss of the rich and satisfying network of relationships that made them feel at home, primarily with God, but also with each other, with themselves, with the creation, with the other creatures, the whole big glorious network, the web of life in which they were enmeshed. That loss is more than the loss of the actual garden. So the story of home in the Bible begins with a tree, and quickly, by the end of Genesis 3, ends with an eviction. So, very briefly, much too briefly, from Genesis chapter 3 right through to Genesis chapter 11, what we see is a story of increasing chaos. Families break up, violence increases. It seems no one can finish anything. In a grand mythic sense, what we are seeing is what happens in homelessness. Cain and Abel and Noah and the Ark and the Tower of Babel. This is an epic sociology of homelessness. And then we get to Abe. Abraham, as he's introduced to us, Abraham as he is known to us now. He appears in the story almost literally used correctly, out of nowhere. Almost as if he was chosen at random, as if someone else could have been chosen in his place. He is at home in modern day Iraq when the voice of God comes to him. God tells him to make himself homeless, to leave his father's house and the way of his ancestors, and to follow God out into the desert. And God makes a promise to Abe out there in the desert as a personification of how we all so often feel, alienated, lonely, crazy. Abe is told by God that he will have a vast family, outnumbering the sand on the beach and the stars in the sky, and they will have a home. The Bible records the response. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So we now have the beginning of the narrative arc. Through Abe, God was intent to make the sons and daughters of Adam at home again. Skipping forward over vast tracts of the story, what we find is that 400 years later, the heirs of Abraham are not living it up in a good and pleasant home. Instead, they're slaves in a foreign land. They toil and they sweat under the unforgiving African sun. They're working themselves to death to build tombs for the pharaohs. However, God has not abandoned them, and he tells Moses, this disgraced murderer who will become their representative, that he has heard their cries. Along with his spokesperson brother Aaron, God uses Moses to set the slaves free. Thus begins the Exodus. The children of Abraham are to be guided into their promised land, into their home. It's a journey across northern Arabia that should take 2 weeks, and it ends up taking 40 years because God has a lot of work to do to get these slaves set free, ready for living in liberty at home. Again, I'm leaping over 30 books of the Bible in one go, but the long and the short of it is that when Moses leads the nation named Israel into their promised land, into their home, they quickly repeat the mistakes of Eden. Instead of living in harmony with their neighbours, they abuse and exploit them. Instead of enjoying their God's goodness, they worship made-up gods, and they do weird and horrible things for them, like sacrifice their babies. God sends them away into exile, makes them homeless again. And there, for a moment in Babylon, they realise what it is they've lost. They cry out, God relents, God brings them home. But guess what? They screw up again. So this is where we are when the New Testament begins. It's been 400 years since any prophet had arisen in Israel. Although Abraham's family still lived on the land that had been promised to them, they felt spiritually as if they were in exile. The pagan Romans, who were brutal beyond our understanding, were in power. So this was not the deal that had been promised to Abraham. People were restless. They were ready for a fight. They were ready to start a war, or at least a movement of some kind. And then suddenly there's this religious zealot named John the Baptist. He comes out of nowhere and he's out in the desert and he's calling people to him. In their droves they're coming as he preaches about repentance and changes of heart and about baptism for the forgiveness of sins. And then along comes his cousin, a tradesman from a no-name town, this guy with no credentials, with no pedigree, with nothing to his name except the fact that he's allegedly able to do miracles and he is certainly able to tell good stories. This guy Jesus begins to insist that he is the Messiah, the long-awaited, anointed one that God was going to send to bring his people truly home. All across Israel, people start to get very excited. This guy Jesus, he knows his Bible inside out. He teaches with authority, almost as if he believes that the Hebrew scriptures were written about him. He genuinely seemed to be able to heal people. The reports were so numerous that even the most hardened skeptic would have reason to doubt. The rumors spread that he was going to lead Israel into battle with Rome, that the kingdom of God would be established, and that means that the enemy would be vanquished and the Hebrew people would finally be put on top of the world where they belong, the children of Abraham. When it became clear that this was not the plan, the one that they had welcomed into Jerusalem with palms, declaring him their king, became the one they despised. They had him put to death, tortured the most vicious way possible, suffocating under his own body weight, hanging on a cross. But within a week, a strange rumor began to spread that the one who had died was alive again. As impossible as it is to believe, 500 people claimed to have seen him, to have eaten with him, to have touched him, to have talked with him. These people got a reputation for sharing everything in common, and their message began to spread. They said that this Jesus was the Messiah and that he will come again to finally bring everyone who is faithful home. But it won't just be the children of Abraham anymore. Everyone is invited, not just the Jews. And the home is not going to be some distant place far away, but right here on earth. God will follow through on his original intention and will make earth a haven, a garden fit for a king. In the very last chapters of the Bible, we read of John's vision where Jesus tells him that in the city of God there will be a tree. A tree planted to heal the nations. People from all over will be invited in and made whole. The ultimate vision of the Bible, the end point of the long story, the terminus of the huge narrative arc is that the Garden of Eden would be recapitulated, would be made new, populated now not just by two, but by everyone. So the story of the Bible is a story about home. It's told between two trees, the tree that brings harm in Eden and the tree that brings healing in the New Jerusalem. Theologically speaking, therefore, home is an absolutely central category. The land is the most important aspect in Israel's history. The idea of home is never far from the text, and the entire superstructure of the Bible rotates around this idea of finding home again. In next week's lecture, we're going to be talking about the economic ethics of the Bible in terms of, I know this is pretty obscure, housing policy in Ireland. Because there's no clearer expression of our contemporary commitment to economic ethics than how we think about houses and profit. So So these are not two random disconnected ideas that I'm just throwing together because I know a bit about Jesus and a bit about wealth and a bit about Ireland and a bit about housing. Rather, this is my targeted attempt to use something that you all can know and touch and feel: the shocking price of renting, the impossible price of buying, the unavoidable reality of homelessness. You can see all of that. And we're going to put that into dialogue with, we're going to put that into interface with the theological ethics side of this course by considering the Bible. So in other words, if you're distressed by those who are suffering in this housing crisis, in this homelessness crisis, you might choose to do a little charity. And I'm not against that. That connects with Christianity because you're caring for the poor and the marginalized. That's what you're meant to do. But you should also, by the end of our lectures, start to see how on the structural level all of these ideas are connected sociologically. The scriptural tradition, the historic practices of the church, they say one thing and we do another thing. So regardless of where you stand, that gives you a dialogue. If you're a Bible-believing Christian and yet you're totally at home with a situation where people can accrue to themselves many houses that they don't live in and that they rent out at a profit in a time when people can't afford houses, then there is a discrepancy, there's a conflict there. And when we get those conflicts between what we say we believe and what we actually do, that allows us to have a dialogue with ourselves. A dialogue that can begin in prayer, but that can spill out in theology and then express itself in mission. We can start describing things. And as we've hammered home in these lectures, for ethics, description is prior to decisions. So as we describe the biblical theme of home, we're given a way into practicing our faith in relation to the reality of houses in Ireland. This is what ethics is all about. So, you say, this biblical stuff is great. Kevin, you should be a preacher. But I know that the inevitable question that you have as IBI students, it's going to come, what's the point? What's the takeaway? How do we apply this? Apply this for us. Well, if the scriptures of the Christians are all about the quest for home, then the baseline cultural narrative of contemporary Irish society no longer seems to be very secular. The scriptures of Christians are all about the quest for home, and the public discourse of Ireland is currently all about the quest for home. There are currently, officially, about 10,000 people homeless, of which 3,800 are children. There are at least 210,000 people waiting for public housing. There are about 70,000 people in mortgage arrears and a similar number whose homes are in negative equity. Rents are growing at rates many times faster than earnings, and a clear property bubble has emerged again. So this is much bigger than a problem with rough sleepers, although the problem with rough sleepers is unimaginably bad. What Ireland is plagued by is an unparalleled housing crisis. Now the government has a plan, it's called Rebuilding Ireland. They launched it 2 summers ago, and it's their scheme for dealing with this crisis. It proposes a solution that overwhelmingly favours market interventions. What that means is that its whole plan is based around the idea that people who are seeking profit will be able to innovate solutions to this problem far better than some kind of government intervention. It does envision some increase in public housing development, but the massive burden for helping people into housing is going to be done through subsidising the landlord industry. So here's where the facts start to come in this video. We currently spend 2.3 million euros a day in supplements for rent. That's money that goes straight into the pockets of landlords. We don't build houses with that. We don't have any collective pool of housing that we're going to be able to draw on in the future generations. 2.3 million euros a day going to help people who can't afford to pay rent, to make rent. What that policy does is put more and more people into fragile housing tenures at the bottom of the market. And it also envisions drawing in more and more people from the top of the market. There's an idea out there that to be modern, Irish people should stop stressing about owning their own home and instead they should rent forever. So the Rebuilding Ireland report that the government has produced talks about this in terms of international norms. The international norm, they say, is that people don't own their own homes. But the report doesn't recognise that in places like Germany, where you don't have to buy your own house, that's because there's a radically different rental structure. There you can sign leases for decades and be assured that rental increases only happen in line with inflation. In Germany, the homes are better built at a lower cost and landlords find it very hard to make a profit. It would be great if Ireland was more like Germany in this regard. But what the government is proposing is actually nothing like that. What they're proposing is a situation where the small group of people who are rich enough to be able to become landlords get richer and richer and richer through tax-funded subsidies, which make the poorer, poorer and poorer. So, even though I'm not able to pronounce the word poorer, I hope that you've understood this argument. The crisis that we have has a solution from the government, which is based around the idea of the market. And if we rest on the market to solve this problem, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. So we've looked at the big overarching narrative arc of finding home in the scriptures, and I think that that gives us a mandate as Christians to be concerned with the task of providing homes for our neighbours, shelter, a place of secure, fixed tenure that they can rely on, which can be a little square in this chaotic world that is theirs. That's an important part of what's required for anybody to pursue their human flourishing. So it's part of the common good to provide housing, and we can find in the scriptures not just lots of proof texting verses, but the big overarching story is concerned with this topic. We worship a homeless God. That's why we're driven to serve homeless people and why we're driven to drive homelessness out of our social reality. Now we do have a crisis around housing and homelessness, and the government's response to that crisis has been this plan called Rebuilding Ireland. And Rebuilding Ireland overwhelmingly imagines a market-driven solution to this problem. So through the invisible hand of the market, if we just get enough people pursuing their own self-interest in terms of profit, somehow, kind of magically, it's almost a religious belief amongst the current government, somehow houses will be provided for everybody. It's a deeply flawed idea. Now, it's not to say that the market doesn't have some part to play in the solution, and it's not to say that making money out of housing is always bad. Neither of those things follow. There is some place for the market, and it is legitimate. There are places for legitimate landlords, that such people exist, and they should be celebrated where we find them. But the problem is so complicated, it requires a complex set of solutions. And I know that as IBI students, what you're going to say is, right, you've laid out the problem, but how do we fix it? Tell me how to fix it. I understand that, and I'm going to give you this handful of different solutions that have been proposed, which are each individually insufficient to solve the problem, but together they add up to kind of a mosaic portrait of how a functional housing system would work. And the first thing is perhaps the easiest thing, because it doesn't require any land, it doesn't require engineering, it doesn't require construction at all. The first thing that we have to do is to make housing a human right, protected by the Constitution. Now, if you think about it, it makes complete sense. The Constitution protects all sorts of human rights, the things that we recognize we need to pursue our flourishing. So we have the human right of the protection of life, and we have the human right for the protection of our freedom of expression, and we have the protections for our human rights of religious observance. We should have some kind of human right to housing. And there's an independent TD from Donegal called Thomas Pringle, who in March 2017 brought a bill to the Dáil called the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Bill. It sadly won no support from the current government. But some law of this nature that would place a range of fundamental human rights, including the right to housing, healthcare, education, and the right to earn a decent living at the heart of state policy, would change the context dramatically in one fell swoop. Housing would go from a policy crisis, how do we solve this problem, to a legal one. We must write laws that would enable local authorities to house everybody. This proposal wouldn't build a single house, but activists could then sue the government and the local authorities to ensure that housing provision, and we definitely have the means by which to provide houses, we just don't have the political will for it. These lawsuits could be brought to force the political will to exist, to slowly gear things up so that everybody could have a home, and that wouldn't be reliant, as the current plan is, on having enough money to pay for it. So the first thing is housing should be a human right. The second thing is, in Ireland we treat property as a commodity. This is something we're going to talk about at length in the lecture. We imagine a house as something to be bought and sold and traded before we ever imagine it as something to be occupied and inhabited. That's why we talk about getting on the property ladder. You're imagining a kind of competition where you step further and further up the ladder. That's a commodity understanding of property. And as long as this happens in an unchallenged way, there's always going to be people left behind, because there's always going to be some people who aren't able to provide for themselves. The problem of commodification can be challenged. It can be fixed really simply through tax. I know tax gets a bad reputation, but when you think about it, tax is pretty amazing. It's a pretty efficient way to keep the lights on and to keep the primary schools open. And in Ireland, property taxes internationally level low. Not to bore you with the details, but it's currently 0.18% of a property's value below €1 million and 0.25% after that. That means that it doesn't treat property like other investments. If I have shares in Intel or in Apple and these shares make a big gain for me, then I get taxed on that at the rate of 33%. Now, if that's called capital gains tax. If a capital gains approach was utilised, then Irish people would stop treating their houses as a productive asset. It would become bad news for them to see their property values rise, because that would mean their tax bill was going to rise next year. That would drive people to see their house not as an asset that they have to hold on to, but as a home, a place to live. If housing prices go up, all of us are less well off. It's really important that young families are able to afford to buy their own homes, but the current system encourages us always to try to make house prices bigger and bigger. And so tax, this might be the only time you've ever heard anyone say the solution to the problem is more tax, but a tax on housing in this particular way would mean that you would be able to counteract the idea that housing is a commodity, which is a myth. It's not real. So tax brings us back closer to reality. So first of all, we need housing as a human right. Second of all, we need to stop treating property as a commodity. And thirdly, we need to meet social housing need through actual public housing. At the moment, social housing need, that is the housing that we have to provide for people who can't afford it on their own, is largely met through private for-profit provision. We've talked about this with the rent supplements. What this does is it functions as a massive incentive to people who are rich enough to be landlords. And that's tax money, again, that we're putting into the landlord's pockets. And it leaves the state with no assets. We collectively as a nation don't have public housing anymore. So it's the national equivalent of the argument that Irish people commonly hear, which is that rent is dead money. I don't know if this argument is one you're familiar with, but certainly in my generation we were told you had to buy a house as soon as you could because rent went into the pockets of the landlord. You should be paying that same amount of money into a mortgage, and that way that money accrues back to you in the form of an asset. So if rent is dead money for us as individuals, then meeting social housing need through rent supplements is dead money grown big on a national scale. It's a shocking scandal. It's amazing that it's allowed to go on. The next thing that we need to do is to increase the public housing stock. We need to build 10,000 social houses a year to keep up with the population growth. And the problem in Ireland is that we have had some very well-known, large-scale public housing failures. You can think classically of Ballymun. So we have to find a way to get over the bias that we have against public housing. It's often seen as a badge of shame if you grew up in public housing. But there's no intrinsic reason why public housing only has to be geared towards people who can't afford to compete in the private market. And that leads us to a brilliant solution. It's called the cost rental model. So in cities like Copenhagen, you have half of the people living in public housing. People who earn huge salaries are in public housing, and they're renting their house from the city. They rent alongside people who can't pay at all. So in a cost rental model, what happens is that the city or the local authority builds public apartment complexes to a standard as high as the most deluxe private developments. You know, built-in rooftop gardens, lots of green spaces, trees, parks, playgrounds, climate-friendly insulation, all that good stuff. And then you let a mix of public and private tenants in, so that everyone who lives there pays 30% of their salary as rent. So if you're an unemployed single mother, talking stereotypically, you would pay 30% of your state support as rent. And me, as a super high paid theologian, I will pay 30% of my salary as rent. And this is economically sustainable because through the law of averages, we know that there will be enough money there to generate a profit, but that profit won't go to shareholders, it'll go to the city, and it'll be a means by which the property can be maintained, and then the local authority will have a pool of money with which to build more similar schemes, so that you're able to propagate these developments around the city without vast amounts of tax money being spent. It's something that can grow organically. The mix of people has lots of social benefits, and we get ourselves out of the planning mess where everybody wants to have their own little detached bungalow, and that means everyone has to have their own little water system and their own little electricity system, and the city gets so sparsely populated that it becomes impossible to have a bus system running on time. This is one of those solutions that seems to cut so many of the loose threads that it's insane that it hasn't yet been implemented. It's how people live in some of the finest cities in the world, in Singapore, in Vienna, in Copenhagen, and it's something that we ought to be doing in Dublin and in Cork and in Galway. This whole section has gone on for more than 10 minutes, so I'm going to stop talking now. But there are lots of other policy measures that we could take that are politically realistic. We could implement a vigorous vacant site levy, so that if you're sitting on a piece of property and nobody is in it, you see these dotted all around the city, then you make it a cost to sit on that property. You tax that exponentially so that it grows year on year on year, that the site is not being used. And you provide an option whereby the person who owns the property, regardless of how bad a condition it is, can sell it to the city in a straightforward process and then unburden themselves of their tax obligation. That way we can get these sites back into use. And finally, we can implement rent control in line with the consumer price index, so that you can't increase the rent just because the market demand allows you to. Instead, that rent would be rooted down to the price of inflation, and that means people know that at least if the rent is going up, it's going up because their salaries are going up. It seems unfair that we have a situation at the moment where such an essential part of human life as finding and securing your home floats free based on the ups and downs of the market. That seems to be a system that's intrinsically geared towards making the rich richer and the poor poorer. So we've talked about housing as a human right, talked about stopping the idea that a house is a commodity. We've talked about meeting the social housing needs through actual public housing, increasing that public housing stock primarily through the use of the cost rental model. We've talked about the vacant site levy. We've talked about inflation controlled rent increases, and there's a bunch of other solutions if you go looking for how we solve this property crisis. But that is all to show you that the biblical theme that we've identified, the importance of finding home and securing home, and the social phenomenon that we have at the moment, which is the housing crisis, those two things can be properly put into dialogue together in like really minute, intricate detail. And that the conversation in the newspapers and on the television about these public policy discussions, they're not alien or removed from the imagination of the scriptures. And as Christians, we're meant to put those two things together. That's a task that requires profound biblical literacy and serious social engagement. It's hard work, but it's work that can be done. Hopefully that has made sense. Okay, so hopefully this has been admittedly a whirlwind tour through both the idea of the theme of finding home in the scriptures and the public policy and social ethical problem of housing and homelessness in Ireland. But hopefully you're able to start to see how these two things fit together. What we're going to do in the lecture is unpack this a little bit more. We're going to consider how Christians have thought about wealth in the scriptures, and then we're going to think even more deeply about how Christians ought to think about housing and homelessness in contemporary Ireland. The housing crisis can be explained. I hope I've shown you that. It can be explained more than that in the light of the scriptures. And that means that the nightmare that thousands of people face in terms of homelessness can be changed. It's a message of hope, fundamentally. If we describe the problem in terms of the scriptural narrative, then that informs the decisions that we're able to make. So hopefully this has made sense. We're going to find out next week in the classroom in Ulysses' house. Thank you for listening to me, and see you next week.